Hello, my name is Ilya Timofeyev, and today we will be discussing cloning, the controversial topic that it is, knowledge issues associated with it, and future reference questions. But first, we have to talk about some history. In around 1938, Hans Spemann first suggested the transfer experiment to test on a fetus. Thereby, he was one of the very first people to suggest cloning. Though his experiments did ultimately fail and his ideas in a way did not be accepted socially by the community, they did live on to influence future generations. And while many things of his were erased, in 1970s these ideas relived through John Gurdon, who successfully cloned the very first frogs. Though he had much more resources than Hans Spemann, he managed to present his ideas in a more approachable fashion, and when he presented his two cloned frogs to the scientific community, this gave way to a whole spearheading of new ideas. And in 1977, Dolly the lamb became the very first adult living animal to be cloned. This was a very big shock to the scientific community, as many were doubting this process in general, but through people like Gurdon and Hans Spemann, this process had finally been completed. And then further on in 1977, Culminia, a mouse, was also cloned, showing that this process was not only available for larger animals. This gave way to a more legal system, as California strove to become the very first state to legalize a therapeutic version of cloning, and more importantly, of all embryos, not just animals, but also human embryos. This was a very, very debated topic, and California remains the only state to have legalized this process, even though many other states have been debating it and are close to doing this. However, in 2003, Great Britain was the very first country as a general country, not just a state or part of a territory, to allow therapeutic cloning and research, in addition to opening the very first stem cell bank. In the end, near the 2004 era, this gave way to a wide variety of animals being cloned, including camels, cats, dogs, horses, and other barn animals. This is important to understand as a historical mark, as when all animals have been cloned, the only animal per se that remains is the Homo sapien, and that is a very difficult question. So now it's time to ask, what is cloning? Let's take a minute and think about our own definition and discuss this as a group. Now that we have figured out some kind of definition of cloning, let's go through and figure out the actual scientific one. Somatic cell nuclear transportation, or cloning as we know it, starts with an egosomatic cell, goes into fusion, and then through processes becomes a blattoclust. This process then goes two ways. Either an embryo develops and eventually becomes the human we know it to become, a baby in this case, or the embryo is destroyed, the cells broken apart and taken into a cultured environment and are stem cells. The baby is known as reproductive cloning, but the cultured stem cell process is known as therapeutic cloning. So in summary, animals have been reproduced, but not yet humans, as the fetus has been killed off prior to birth, and that is a therapeutic method. But what if we went past that stage and humans did develop? Let's take a little moment and discuss some knowledge issues or questions in general concerning cloning. This process is very controversial, and based on the knowledge we have gathered so far scientifically, who has the right to have children, no matter how they are created, cloning, naturally, or other methods? And if a clone originates from an existing person, who is the legal parent? Now, let's take a step back and view this from a whole different angle. Before we were discussing these questions from our perspective, but let's discuss this through the clone's perspective. What are some social challenges a clone might face, especially a child? Twins are natural clones, so why is that any different? And lastly, human dignity factor. Does that tie in? Let's take a minute to talk these through. Now that we've talked those over, let's get some more information in. Let's talk about the pros of cloning. Organ replacement. you can have a substitute for natural reproduction, because through infertility and impotence, many humans cannot reproduce, and through a process like cloning, it would be a safe option. Organ replacement, on the other hand, also benefits from this process, as humans would be able to develop other ones with similar organs. Also, bringing out desirable traits. Genes can be copied and made so that humans would be almost perfect through leadership, courage, selflessness, and others. These are just some of the pros associated with cloning. Now, let's erase all of that and let's talk about some of the cons now. Cons usually mean bad things, and in this case, they really are. Detrimental to genetic diversity, first of all, a quite obvious one, but the more interesting one to imagine is invitation to malpractices. Through cloning humans, you take on a lot of power. The power to manufacture humans. What you do with them is all completely up to you, and this is seen in the movie The Island, as clones are taken as sold as products. Another perspective we have to consider is the religious one. This is one of the most important battles that must be fought in order to advance cloning, as with cloning, you basically take on the emulation of God. You create humans. Considering these pros and cons and the condemnation by religion of cloning, does your opinion change? Do the positives outweigh the negatives? And in both therapeutic and reproductive cloning, the embryo is destroyed, seemingly meaninglessly. Does that change views? Ultimately, is human cloning playing with nature? How is it different than other reproductive methods? Should it be regulated? By whom? Should it even be allowed? Should one use reason or emotion to choose the limitation or growth of this controversial practice? Thanks for your time, and thanks for listening.